Okay, I will make a start. I was trying to check the screen for how many people have entered the room, but I've only served to just change to the next slide, which I didn't want to put up straight away. So welcome, everybody. I suspect many people on this call are familiar with our research methods seminar series here with EDICa. But just in case there are people who are not, I'm just going to go through a few very quick slides before I introduce our very esteemed speaker, Professor Almuth McDowall, who will be talking to us about the co-production in the context of neurodiversity. So here comes the first of the quick slides. Just a quick reminder to everybody about the code of conduct. This is not just for seminar series. This is some words that should probably be applicable in any kind of environment, particularly in electronic environments. So here, just want to kind of make it clear this is a harassment-free experience for everybody, being respectful of everybody's differences and what brings people together as well. And certain languages, etc., are not appropriate. In terms of accessibility, just a quick note for anybody who wants to, you can activate closed captions by clicking on the three dots on your Zoom screen and selecting the closed caption option. So just some quick welcome housekeeping and introductions. As you'll see at the bottom here, Almuth will be looking to speak for around about 35 minutes or so. Keen to use as much of the best part of an hour that we have with you. But if you've got any kind of questions or anything that's more as we go along, then please feel free to use the Q&A function, and that might be something that we'll return to later on. But we'll also be taking questions as usual at the end of the presentation. And I think there's a range of options available there. So just to quickly remind everybody, forgive me if you know this already, if you're familiar with EDICa, then this is probably, you switch off for 10 seconds, let's say. But if not, EDICa has now been running for best part of 3 years. Linking very much in with the nature of today's seminar is that our research, the whole centre is based around evidence-based research for inclusive careers, and a big part of that, as you'll see at the bottom point, is the co-design approach, hence our invite today, let's say. A big part of what EDICa is about is to focus on what organisations can do, remove barriers, to improve experience for historically marginalised groups, to allow them to access and thrive, and to also conduct interdisciplinary research. And a big part of all the different work streams as well is to build up a range of communities of practice, both international and national. So just a quick kind of recap on what we've been doing of late, a range of research seminars, some of which you may have attended. 10 out of 10 if you've attended all 4 so far. Well, this is kind of give you an idea. We have got a further research seminar early in 2026. I'll mention that very quickly in the next slide. So there you go. This is just some details of some other events related to EDICa and not just related to our research seminar series, EDI plan for funding, research methods, as I mentioned before. That will be early 2026. Information really that will be announced as soon as we have it. We also have the symposium, which is 20th of November. And just a reminder that today's presentation will be recorded. We'll get it all neat and tidy, upload it to our website, and we'll get the captions sorted out and make it available to everybody and make it accessible as much as we can. So just a quick reminder of our website and where you can find some information about us and a range of other things, not least the research we've been doing here. So that brings me now to be able to hand over to Professor Almuth McDowall. She's a professor in organisational psychology at Birkbeck University in the School of Social Sciences. But importantly, she's also the lead for the Centre for Neurodiversity Research at work down there in Birkbeck in London. So I'm just going to hand you over now, and I think I'll probably have to unshare my slides and let you speak, Almuth.
Thank you so much, James, for the warm introduction, and thank you all for being here, for coming, for listening. And before I say anything else, let me now share my slides. All right. And let me just bring them up to full slide view. Perfect. Okay, so co-production in a neurodiversity context. We do a lot of work on neurodiversity at Birkbeck, but particularly and with a long history of doing that from a biomedical paradigm. So looking at, for instance, diagnostic markers in very early childhood, even in babies, of autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Our own work in our research center is much more from a critical disability paradigm, acknowledging that neurodiversity is not synonymous with disability. Some people might identify as disabled, some might not. But what is behind a critical disability paradigm is the notion that it's environment and support and understanding that make us more or less abled. And talking about abledness, I had very major surgery at the beginning of the summer, which has left me with an asthmatic cough. So if at any point I need to interrupt proceedings, have my ginger and lemon tea and have a good cough, then please, allow me to do that. So what I will talk about, co-design and co-production and a little bit of co-creation. So what does the co-bit mean for doing things together? Then in the context of neurodiversity and an increasing advocacy movement, our own neurodiversity in business-funded research, so funded by non-traditional funding, a piece of research that we have done funded by Acas. I will also share really honestly some feedback that we've had from potential research funders. And then finally, what does it all mean? And also giving you an opportunity to ask questions. Doing research together, the co. What does it all mean? So, co-design, as in designing research, you can probably tell it's about what it says on the tin. It's about the design of research, taking a collaborative approach, and it's got a really established history now in public health research to ensure benefits for end users, because there is no point researching a healthcare intervention actually if people don't like it, right, and they don't use it to get better. Could be really, really well designed, but if it falls flat or it doesn't meet the needs of certain communities, you're creating exclusion rather than inclusion. So the whole idea here is that you involve the public or citizens, as some paradigms would say, to shape the research questions, to shape the methods, and then to review the outcomes. Co-production takes this approach perhaps one step further, where, of course, let's be real, right? There are always power issues in research. It's never ever power free. But as much as we possibly can, we try and level out the power dynamics to think about an equitable partnership where every voice is heard of the researchers who are doing the research, practitioners who might know about the topic much more from the practical angle rather than the theory, the concepts, and the methodologies, and the public, the citizens, the intended end beneficiaries. So it should really be about shared power and responsibility, where we all play our part, about mutual learning, where each voice is heard in the same way, and you don't have the authority in the proverbial white coat who knows better. And also genuine inclusion, especially of otherwise potentially marginalized groups, be it by their skin color or by their sexual orientation, or combination indeed of marginalized identities, which you often find in neurodiversity communities. So co-production is about the what, right? It's about knowledge and understanding and actually knowing what it is that we find out. It's about research methodology, and it's about the outputs and outcomes. So the output might be research papers, there might be blogs, there might be vlogs, they might be artistic endeavors. And then what are the outcomes? And of course, in academia, we love to talk about impact because it's one of the things that we get measured. Actually, what difference has this made in my own context to organizations, but also wider reaching then to societies? But also we need to ask why we are doing it, right? Co-production is not easy. It's not for the faint-hearted. So why are we doing it? What are our motivations for engaging in this more equitable process of creating knowledge, disseminating outputs, and hopefully leading some lasting outcomes and impact? Food for thought. I also wanted to introduce you of the paradigm of co-creation. So my lovely colleague Mutu De Silva and her colleagues have been working on this, particularly from an innovation context in higher education, but also in organizations. So it's about creating social and business value while addressing economic challenges and societal challenges. Right? What are some of the economic challenges we are facing at the moment? Well, we've all heard about the cost of living crisis. What does that actually mean for our society? But also societal changes, right? Think about the DEI backlash, thanks to the orange man, dare I name him. I've seen this in my own context because most of my research is about occupational health. It is about inclusion. So many of my friends work in this field. People, be very, very aware they've all been made redundant because suddenly DEI conversations are not being had in organizations to the same extent that they were being had even a year ago. So creating the value across science and technology and society. And the key actors in this are dry, stuffy academics, such as myself, workplaces, policymakers, such as the government, Acas, who funded some of our research, the third sector, Neurodiversity in Business is a charity, and the citizens. And I just wanted to invite you to listen to an anecdote from nearly 20 years ago, which tells you how old I am. So I got awarded my doctorate in organizational psychology. I came home all proud. And do you know what? There's nothing better a leveler of ego than a 3-year-old. So I said to my family, including my then 3-year-old eldest daughter, I said, well, Mummy is a doctor now. She's a psychologist. And my eldest Nimwe looked at me at disdain and she said, but Mummy, you can't mend broken arms. You're not a real doctor. And I said, well, Nimwe, but I can help businesses make their people happy. So as an organizational psychologist, and I'm still chartered, registered, and legally allowed to practice, yes, I work with organizations because I've always been fascinated by work, but actually the end beneficiary of everything that I do is always the person in organizations. So that is my motivation for doing co-creational, co-produced research. Neurodiversity, the not so new EDI kid on the block, right? Have we really done gender and race equality? I don't think so. But over the last few years, there has been a real focus in the context of work on neurodiversity. There has been a whole plethora of conferences springing up, practitioner reports, whether it's the CIPD and City and Guilds, lots and lots of attention, lots and lots of activity. Has that necessarily translated into better practice and policy? Well, we shall see. At the same time, also lots of myth around neurodiversity. Well-cited book, ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, doesn't exist. That's actually what I was taught in my own psychology degree about 20 years ago. Actually, wasn't it just about rough and tumble play in boys, and will boys always be boys? Now, of course, we know that it is a neurodevelopmental condition. It affects just as many girls and women as boys and men. It's just they're often not diagnosed because the diagnostic criteria are very white and male-centric. There's been lots and lots of talk about an epidemic of autism, of ADHD. Well, it's not an epidemic, because when you control for factors such as women being diagnosed much later in life, you see a gentle, steady increase in diagnosis, which can be fully explained by better clinician awareness, by better public awareness. And also epidemic, the word presupposes that being neurodivergent is a disease, and it most certainly is not. At the same time, also very vocal dialogue about the superpowers that being neurodivergent might bring, such as hyperfocus or intense interest or great creativity. Well, what research tells us, yes, there are marked strengths, but as with any other strength that we might have, be very, very careful about overusing them, because that can lead to burnout. So in practice, what is happening? What we're finding is that there are extremely varied levels of knowledge about neurodiversity. Some organizations already know a lot and they seek really good advice. Others don't even know where to start. Very varied levels of support. I remember when we did the first NIB study and people got in touch with me from New Zealand, and they said, actually, in my organizations, it's more okay to come out as gay than as being neurodivergent. It's not something that you can do. And even when you do, you don't get any support. There are still barriers to access diagnosis and healthcare. So there is a large population health study on autistic people from UK data, and that shows us that if you are a girl of color, you are 7 times as unlikely to have received a diagnosis and support early in life compared to white boys. Diagnosis also depends on where you live here in the UK. So much better in the south, in more affluent areas, much worse in the north, where there are more deprived communities. So there's a social context. Very strong advocacy movement, right? Just go on LinkedIn and type in #neurodiversity, you will see. We've seen many more employee resource groups over the last few years, so where people got together in organizations to advocate for the rights of neurodivergent workers. And there has been a real emphasis on lived experience, so a neurodivergent identity as a source of power and influence and knowledge in organizations. And please don't get me wrong, I think it's incredibly important to hear the voices of lived experience. That's why I do this research. But actually, does lived experience always equate specialist knowledge? I leave you with that thought. What brought me to the topic? So on the left-hand side here, as a native German, it's better not to admit this, but I've got this thing for garden gnomes. I don't know why, but a few years ago, my family gifted me these lovely hand-painted garden gnomes for my birthday. And you can probably see a real difference where some of these are painted with an incredible level of detail, just in the same way that some of my family members, where each home-prepared meal is a work of art. It's beautifully laid out, through to people who would rather stuff down a sandwich and then rush off and do the next thing. Also very varied dependency needs. So some of my family members, well, I mean extended family, you know, even my nieces, nephews, various hangers on to me, that's all family, where it would take you a long time to work out they're a little bit different, through to people with very high dependency needs. One of my family members had chosen to remain nonverbal until they hit their 18th birthday. So my own lived experience has brought home to me that actually there is such variation, there is such need for support, right? What do you do if you don't have an Auntie Almuth, who is a psychologist who comes into school and has a very robust discussion with the headmaster? That is also an exhibition of privilege. Similarly, in research, there has been an over-focus on children and adolescents. We've seen really irrational organizational practice, right? We've got many autism at work programs. Where are the dyslexia at work programs? So that's some of my motivations. This is what underpins our work in the center, which at the moment is a very small center because it used to be an academic practice collaboration. Sadly, my co-director had to step down because business concerns took over, but perhaps something, and I very much hope something that we can rectify again in the immediate future. So how we work, we've got an advisory board. We meet formally twice a year and informally as and when needed. And very deliberately, it's composed of practitioners and academics with very different neurotypes, so a whole range represented of lived experience, different intersecting identities, and also different knowledge and background. So health economics, disability practitioners, DI researchers, we've got a psychiatrist, we've got a member of parliament who sits on the all-party parliamentary group around dyslexia. Right, it took me a while to say that. Why the board is essential to our center: they act as critical friends to scrutinize the research that we're doing and want to be doing. And they have direct input into our research. So sometimes they bring opportunities to us, neglected topics that nobody yet is potentially looking at. Voices that are not being heard, for instance, such as Acas and Tourette's. That's on my to-do list to at some point delve into. Why is co-production essential in neurodiversity research? Multiple marginalization is likely. So access to diagnosis and support is not gender blind, is not power blind, is not blind to how affluent and privileged your parents are. So there are some groups in society who are far more likely not to have been diagnosed, or to indeed have been misdiagnosed. So for instance, women who identify as neurodivergent are very likely at some point in their lives to have been misdiagnosed as having a personality disorder. Much research is still rooted in a medical model that people need fixing, right? Established researchers will write about ADHDers as, quote, a burden to society. Different neurotypes think differently, so we really need to think about a nuanced interpretation. I have learned in a very humble and very good way from my autistic collaborators to be extremely careful about sarcasm and irony, and to be really direct in my communication about whether something is for information or whether something is a genuine discussion topic, so that I don't confuse people. Whereas somebody with a very different neurotype might get bored with long explanations. And again, there's always a fine compromise to be sought. So our NIB-founded research, how am I doing for time? I think I'm doing good. So Neurodiversity in Business is a UK charity spearheaded by the fabulous Dan Harris. And I say this with genuine admiration. Dan is an incredible mover and shaker and networker. He's got a young son, the Joshi man, who is autistic and nonverbal. And indeed, Dan, I think it's about 3 years ago, was also diagnosed as autistic and an ADHDer. And he's got that real wish and need to benefit neurodivergent people in society, but also specifically at work and in business, because employment statistics are really, really challenging. Only 1 in 3 autistic people here in the UK currently is in gainful employment, and many other groups, such as dyslexics, we don't even have data on. So it's run by volunteers with a little paid help, and the end beneficiaries are people in the workplace. So we are about to start our 3rd piece of NRB produced research. What we always go through is a co-production process throughout the research process, where we've got a reference group, so dry, stuffy academics, practitioners, but also people with lived experience who are working at the moment with differing levels of seniority, work foci. Then we develop our research questions, a blueprint for how we're going to answer those research questions. We have been doing a lot of surveys recently, for better, for worse, simply for the geographical reach that you could not have with interviews or more in-depth methods. What we've learned through our research, that we need to put as much focus on instructions and layout, as well as on wording of questions. We've also learned the hard way that a lot of the validated measures that we use in psychology, organizational science, business science, that editors and reviewers like because they have been used beforehand, they don't really make much sense to neurodivergent people because they prefer much simpler wording, much shorter sentences and fewer questions. So sometimes we then write our own bespoke measures. Then we test, we gain feedback again. And what we also do is we do community information sessions that are open to everyone, where we disseminate what the research is all about and how everybody will benefit and hear about the findings. So what we learned, the first set of lessons, that we need to put much more emphasis on instructions on framing in online research to avoid misunderstandings. So really clearly guide people through any questionnaire, through any interview protocol. So the kind of prompts that we wouldn't usually spell out here, they're really, really good. Neurodivergent people are extremely concerned about what happens to their data. So much more than in other research settings where I found that people kind of trusted us to do a good job. We had to explain really explicitly how we would anonymize data, how we would make sure that no personal data can be identified. There was also a bit of mistrust and distrust. So neurodiversity in business, right? Cue the word business. Some of the advocacy communities thought and inferred that we were doing the research for the commercial gain of businesses, that somehow we would be selling our data. And we had to try really hard to explain, no, no, no. The intended beneficiaries are the people in organizations. What we learned about constructs. So one of the constructs that we are always interested in is psychological safety, which in Amy Edmondson's terms was about an environment where it's okay to make mistakes and to learn from them, to give direct feedback. So it's a team or individual construct. But we now understand that neurodiversity advocates understand it really differently. It's about the need not to mask and not to have to suppress your neurodivergent traits, such as stimming or continuously, twiddling your pen when you're talking to people because you need that physical distraction, or twirling your hair, as one of my family members always does. So not to do that so you appear more typical. And actually, existing measures don't really capture this. I don't yet have an answer to this, but it was a learning. What we learned about the outputs. So in 2023, we tried really hard, and we had a generous corporate donation to have a really nice, simple report that was beautifully typeset and very accessibly and engagingly formatted, but not very accessible for people with limited reading, because we didn't have it as HTML on the website. Whereas in 2024, NIB said, okay, fine, we're going to put this right. It's going to be volunteer-led, focus on accessibility. We're going to have data both in Word, as words, but also as tables. But you know what? Everybody is still reading the 2023 report, even though the 2024 one is better from an accessibility point of view for wider communities. Nobody is reading it. And I think, that's my explanation, it doesn't look so good, doesn't look so pretty. Our Acas research. So Acas are kind of a government arm, government institution that particularly deal with conflict in the workplace. And they know that about 80% of calls to their helplines are line managers who want to know about neuro-inclusion, neurodivergent workers who feel that they're not being heard. Again, co-creation was built into the project. We really designed it with accessibility in mind, always keeping in mind that line managers who don't know anything about the topic, they are our audience. We took a triangulated approach, so literature review, expert consultation, and case studies. We made sure that we built in lived experience from our research team, our advisory board, but also from the Acas side of things. So the commissioner of the research also brought that. And we had a lived experience review before the publication of the output. What we learned about our audience in the consultations that we had with people, there was a lot of blaming of line managers that they don't know. And indeed, James has written about this, about line managing neurodivergent workers. I find it so emotionally draining. But you know what? It is hard when you're line managing people with very, very different neurotypes. So actually, we try to flip that round to say, actually, it's line managers that need supporting rather than blaming. It's not easy to distill academic research into simple messages, right? Here's a surprise. And multiple channels for dissemination were really appreciated. And what really surprised me was the research was pretty UK-centric, and that was our brief. But actually, in one of the open dissemination sessions, we reached nearly 50 countries in one live session. And to me, that was a real reward for having done this research. What we learned about the outputs here, Acas provided us with very, very clear accessibility guidelines. So we had a template to work through that made things much more easier and straightforward for us. But actually that it was then easier to read for everyone didn't mean that it was easier to access, because the feedback we had from the dyslexic communities was, where are the figures? Where are the pretty things that I can look at? It's all words and a bit of green wording, so black wording and green wording. But actually, I'm really missing figures, because whereas their accessibility guidelines are, don't use figures, use text, because it can be easier read with a text reader online. Managing the unforeseen. We had some surprise community guests in one of the expert consultations. They were for people who already know about neuro-inclusion, so that we can learn from best practice. And somehow, I still don't know how, some community members who, I dare say, weren't expert had managed to log on to the session and try to really, dare I say, hog it, asking lots and lots of questions, keep interrupting, saying, I don't understand this question, I don't understand this question, this is too difficult for me. And actually, in that moment, I had to make a hard and tough decision and really explicitly say, I'm so sorry that it's difficult for you. We need to focus on the task in hand here to consult our experts. Would you mind stepping out now? Not proud of it, but sometimes that is needed to get the research done. So what we do to address co-production in our research: funding from non-traditional sources such as the charity sector, the third space, where co-creation is already part of the brief. We refine research questions, foci, the process in genuine collaboration, such as the NIB research, the Acas research. We have our research protocols and tools reviewed and scrutinized, and I take my hat off to the autistic communities. They will see errors and inconsistencies that my eye would never see, and that is a good and a positive thing. Also iterative reviews as the research take place to help make sense of the data. So for instance, we had very low internal consistencies for our psychological safety measures, and we actually went back to some of the co-production data, and then it clicked with us. People actually have a very, very different understanding of the construct. Do funders understand co-production? It's another story. Feedback that we had from funders here in the UK that co-production could potentially jeopardize research objectivity. So a suspicion here that we as researchers would go native and get sucked into the organizational context. That if we closely collaborate with some particular organizations, well, does that automatically mean a lack of generalizability? We also still get, and I still haven't been able to sell my soul and go down that route. Why don't you go down the condition-specific route and just look at dyslexia, just look at autism? Because our preference is always to look at neurodiversity more broadly for good reason. And what is the impact on our motivations, right? Remember that the co is not only about the what, the knowledge, it's also about the motivation, the why. Should we sell our souls? And sometimes I wonder, actually, is it all worth it? Yes, it is worth it. And what I've learned so far, lived experience, co-production, particularly also in this neurodiversity space, can elicit very, very direct feedback. No airs and graces. It's just like, no, you got that bit really, really wrong. And you have to prepare for yourself for that, right? You have to be psychologically robust to take it. Collaboration and accessibility, such as in the example that I gave you about the expert consultation, does not mean that anything goes, and we as researchers have to tolerate everything. We need to be really, really clear in communication and instructions, and always setting the scene, explaining things. Some of our institutional protocols are really real barrier to co-production. So for instance, our standard ethics forms, some of you researchers might have the same thing, they are that long. They use terminology, acronyms that actually the public and particularly advocacy community in this space don't understand. And that is not a good thing. Shouldn't we also adapt our ethics and research protocol to actually suit the intended beneficiary? Funders don't necessarily get what we are trying to do. So what are the options? To give up, go elsewhere, or maybe do unfunded research? Going back to co-creation, remember co-creation is really about the different stakeholders, also acknowledging business communities. And as a work psychologist, those are also my communities. Benefiting the citizen, it's been really lovely to receive some spontaneous positive feedback from end beneficiaries. People who wrote in, sometimes also very anonymously, to write to the research team and saying, thank you for doing this work. I finally feel that my voice is being heard. We had also very thoughtful and surprising insights about the global community. So for instance, the stigma in New Zealand, I was telling you about that earlier. Similarly, I've learned a lot about South America, where there's also still a lot of stigma, and it is very, very genderized, where, for instance, parents might admit that they've got an autistic boy. They would not admit to an ADHD girl. Business benefits, well, as a researcher, you can't always control what lands I think our 2024 NIRB research is far better than the 2023 because we also included the perspective of colleagues, but people aren't reading it. Maybe the message was too complicated. Some of the societal benefits, of course, how our research percolates, sometimes that takes a very, very long time in terms of having the impact on businesses and communities. And it can be hard as a researcher where you don't immediately see where things go. So thank you so much. I think I've talked for long enough and it's high time for some questions, and I will now stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that very insightful and very interesting presentation, Almuth, and impeccable timing as well. Lots of questions have appeared now. I was going to come up with some questions, but we had no questions until 2 minutes ago, and now we have several now. So I'll start with the first question that came in about 5 minutes ago. Somebody's asking, the motivation questions you had in the feedback sound a little quote-unquote transactional, almost like a cost-benefit analysis. Should we work harder on making it more fun and rewarding? I suppose that could mean a range of things, but so if you want to comment on that at all.
It's a really interesting question, one that I grapple with because I know from my work with organizations, the thing that convinces them about the value of our research and also about inclusion in the workplace is a difference to the bottom line, right? Is this actually to my benefit? But when you focus so much on efficiency, productivity, on benefit gain, actually, I think there is also a moral and societal imperative for looking at diversity-related topics. And yes, does it then not take the fun out of the research? You know, this should surely be an enjoyable element to research, and particularly when you're taking a co-productive, co-creational approach. If it is boring and if it's not engaging, people just won't come. And people won't devote their time. So we actually spend a lot of time on trying to entice people in and getting them to the round table, whether the round table is real or whether it is virtual. So I hope that is at least some way addressing that question.
Very much. Another question, aside from commending you on your clear and honest presentation, this person says they've got quite a broad question. Given the current EDI climate, obviously things that a lot of people are aware of and you touched on at the beginning of your presentation, what do you see the future of neurodiversity in workplace research focusing on? Slightly deviating from the nature of the co-production aspect, but I think it's a question definitely worth asking.
What we've seen a lot over the last year is that specific DEI-related roles, people who had neurodiversity as part of their portfolio, they've been made redundant. Those roles don't exist anymore. And then usually the rather blasé corporate explanation is, well, because we're now embedding it into everybody else's role and its quote has become part of our DNA. So we don't need those distinct champions anymore. But really, you know, if you look around you in organizations, have we done race equality? Have we done gender equality? Have we done genuine neuro inclusion? I just generally don't think that has happened. My sincere and perhaps naive hope is that the pendulum has swung so far anti-DEI so quickly that surely there must be some momentum to swimming back again, because we live in a very international, multicultural society, right? I was talking earlier about, you know, there is certainly no epidemic of neurodivergent diagnosis because A, it's not an illness, and also if you account for you know, for instance, now women getting diagnosed, whereas a few years they simply weren't. We've seen a steady increase. But what that means in reality is if you put all the neurodivergent conditions together, kind of the rough population estimate is 1 in 5 of your neurodivergent workers will identify as neurodivergent. Actually, that is not that small a minority. So surely it's a responsibility as an employer and as a society that that conversation doesn't get put to one side. I think the key to addressing it in a more positive way is to make it a positive performance and inclusion conversation rather than a remedial one. I think that's perhaps one of the unintended consequences of our UK legislation. If somebody declares special requirements, you then have to make disability adjustments. So a lot of organizational focus in practice is on post hoc adjustments. So you wait for James, for Almuth to tell you that they're different, and then you go, oh, okay, what can I do now? Rather than expecting that actually in your workforce, there are going to be different ways of behaving, thinking and feeling, and actually designing a job with that variation in mind. That's hopefully where we should shift to. And of course, the use of technology there also brings us many advantages, because that's what the giant COVID experiment showed us, right? That actually we can get flexible working, right? Because we all had to during COVID. Whether we're always doing it well is another matter. But for instance, flexible working so benefits neurodivergent workers. And we've now got the evidence, actually, we can make it happen. And we've got the technology to do that.
Very much. I think I've got 3 questions here. I don't know how you feel about methods, perhaps you've not touched on, and your familiarity with autoethnography, something I'm familiar with, but I've not had any personal experience of. So somebody's asking, how can we distance ourselves from autoethnography to open ourselves to co-construction in an action research approach to include all voices? Should we distance ourselves?
I don't think there's anything wrong at all about autoethnography, because autoethnography, I actually teach a postgraduate certificate in neurodiversity and coaching at Berkeley, and our students, as their assignment, they do an autoethnographic piece of work. And autoethnography is about reflecting on your self-experience in a social context. And that requires a great level of reflectivity and reflection to do that well. What sometimes happens, actually, that goes for researchers and for practitioners in the neurodiversity space, that we assume that our autobiographic experience is also somebody else's experience. And actually, good autoethnography shouldn't be self-indulgent. It shouldn't be that self-focused, because it is about the social context. I don't have anything bad to say about autoethnography. I would really encourage everybody to read the paper by Chantel Lewis and Jason Arday, who are both neurodivergent, identify as Black academics, and they talk about things that we see that you will never see. They talk about the double marginalization of being from the global majority, being neurodivergent. It's probably one of the most beautiful and profound pieces of academic writing that I've ever read.
Thank you very much. I've got another question from somebody. It's in 2 parts, but we'll take one at a time, because I think the second question is a good question, but I don't think they go together. Anyway, I'll start with it. I've often noticed from advocacy groups, moral, ethical arguments are advanced for why neuro inclusion is important. But you are an organizational psychologist, and I was wondering what your experience is of how performance, organizations, benefits land with organizations versus the moral and the ethical ones.
So the argument about performance is an interesting one. And I think one thing that I would say would like to say very clearly, please, can we do away with generic performance management frameworks, right? The generic competency-based systems that we often use here in the UK, where in order to progress, you have to be good at absolutely everything. And I'm going to overgeneralize now, but neurodivergent people often make far better specialists than they make generalists. What you often find is they've got a really intuitive way of spotting errors before they have occurred. They've often got incredible capacity to visually represent a workflow in their head and know, actually, this bit, if you keep doing it like that, it will never work, because you know, some ADHDers are the best people who you ever want around you in a crisis, because they will know intuitively this is where our energy and resources need to go next, rather than, you know, waiting around as we do in higher academia. You know, we have a working group followed by a working party followed by a subcommittee before we make any decision. So actually harnessing that talent and making it part of what we do, because yes, we have seen the advent of AI that is now taking over lots and lots of, you know, lower level jobs, but actually AI can't yet do complex systems thinking. And this is exactly what neurodivergent people do well. They often excel in the exception, but are less good at routine things. But actually, where the world of work and the future of work is going, we need people who are good at the exception, because that's exactly the kind of thing that you can't automate, and getting that message through.
Good. Questions are coming in now. I won't say thick and fast, but they're certainly picking up a little bit more. Part two of the question, effectively, it's saying a lot of your research is about trying to inform line manager practice. Does your research have anything to say for line managers who happen to be neurodivergent?
Not specifically, but one thing that is coming out of the research is line managers who are neurodivergent themselves. They are often then seen as a source of expertise in the organization for all things neurodiversity, but they're then expected to be that unpaid helpline on top of everything else that they do. And actually that can create vulnerability, because they don't have unlimited resources either. You know, whilst organizations are now saying, well, we're embedding, you know, DEI into everything that we do need to acknowledge, and the Acas report talks about that, actually it should be an explicit part of people's workload to say, actually, you know, X amount of your time you're actually devoting to this, because you can't expect people to do those sorts of things just for free as part of their organizational citizenship.
I totally agree with you. You've already given me a heads up on some research that I did quite a few years ago now, and that was very much one of the things that came from that as well. Totally concur with you. It's part of somebody's job, so people's time needs to be reflected in that.
Yeah.
Got a quick question here, slightly broader than the actual specific theme of the workshop. Somebody's saying that much of the expression of EDI issues can often come out in courts and employment tribunals. Can anything be done to try and kind of avoid or improve this, what is essentially an adversarial kind of approach to resolving these matters or trying to make improvements?
Yes, I think from where I'm sitting and what I have observed, a lot of the training and education that is going on in organizations doesn't hit the spot, because it is very often condition specific, which is nonsense, because there are such high levels of co-occurrence, and actually people are often misdiagnosed. We know about diagnostic overshadowing, so the first label that you get then sticks. So often too condition specific, often very focused on disability adjustment. So what do you do once people have, declared their requirements, but that is very compliance focused, right? So doing the minimum so that you actually stay within the bounds of the law. What we need to put far more emphasis on is relationships and communication. One thing that is, you know, a totally cost-free, preemptive, neuro-inclusive adjustment that all of us can make is be far clearer, positive, and inclusive in our communication, right? You know, those long corporate emails where it's everything and the kitchen sink, you don't really know, is this for information? Is this for all of us? Do I need to be doing something different? About one issue at a time, be really clear and concise, because our working memory, sorry to break it to you, is limited for all of us, right? It's very limited when we are under stress, and actually limited processing speed and working memory is pretty much an issue for most neurodivergent people. So this is something that we can all do, but actually starting with relationships, going away from the condition-specific focus and thinking much more about preemption rather than adjustment afterwards. I think those three things would go a long way.
I've got one last question, and because it's on very much on the theme of the actual this particular webinar, hopefully we can just squeeze a quick answer in. So forgive me if this does require a longer answer. Somebody's asking whether, do you have any particular advice, because this is something you did actually touch on, about leveling power structures in the act of doing co-production. What can you do to kind of remove the barriers for neurodivergent people to kind of make sure that they feel that they're included, I suppose, in that sense, and being, you know, enter into that kind of relationship, which can be quite forbidding or, you know, overbearing perhaps.
Really, really clear and inviting communication that signposts that everybody's voice is heard, and creating a climate also of psychological safety. So one of the things that I often do is, you know, I've had some tough lessons along the way in a really humble way. So I remember I gave a seminar during Neurodiversity Week 2 years ago, and somebody in the audience was very courageous to ask me, and they were in tears, and they said, you know, look, I just had an ADHD diagnosis, and I'm going for an autism diagnosis tomorrow. Is there anything that you could tell me now that would make me feel better about myself? And I remember, you know, I felt incredibly tearful in that moment. I thought, gosh, you know, you have to say something. So I said, well, you know, first of all, thank you so much for your trust and openness to say this. This must have taken a lot of courage to say that in front of an audience whom you don't know. And I just wanted you to know I heard you and I'm with you. And the simple courage of now having said this, isn't that a wonderful quality that you've just demonstrated? So using a lot of affirmation and validation, and also admitting to some mistakes, right? I remember, you know, early on when I started working in this space, I made a flippant comment, oh, aren't we all sometimes a little bit autistic? And I still cringe back to that moment. And I think, Almuth, what possessed you to say that? But I will share with people when I've made mistakes and make them a topic of conversation. So it then becomes hopefully normalized that actually none of us get everything right all of the time, and really putting an emphasis on that psychological safety where we can all learn from each other, because that's what co-production is all about. I hope this helps.
I think it definitely does help. Obviously, people can put comments in, but we're obviously going to have to finish this off now. We've had lots of kind comments and well-wishing from people who've not been able to stay for the full 1 hour. I would just like to thank you so much, Almuth, for being first rate. This has been really, really, really good, and you've gone beyond what we asked of you. You've had lots of tough questions that have gone beyond the boundaries of what you came here to talk to us about, but clearly well within your expertise. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. And I think somebody in the chat wanted some references. I can only say if that person's still on the line, please just drop us an email at EDICa and we'll sort that out for you. I don't think we've got time to arrange that just this moment in time. So thank you very much. Quick round of applause for me, but there's lots of claps and love hearts flying through the screen, which is always a good sign. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, for being such a genuine audience, and you such a genuine host. Thank you.
Welcome.